In the Middle Ages, kings ruled by blood, but merchants ruled by something far more powerful: money. There were moments in medieval Europe when a king would summon his nobles, gather his soldiers, and still be unable to fund a war. And when that happened, he had to do something humiliating. He had to ask a merchant for a loan. Imagine that for a moment. A crowned ruler, kneeling, metaphorically, before a man whose only weapon was a ledger. This was the quiet revolution of medieval power, because while kings fought wars and nobles guarded their pride, merchants were building something far more dangerous: control over the flow of wealth. And once someone controls the flow of wealth, they eventually control the king. To understand how this happened, you must forget the romantic image of medieval society. Most people imagine a rigid pyramid. At the top, the king. Below him, nobles. Below them, knights and peasants. Merchants were supposed to be somewhere near the bottom. Traders, shopkeepers, middlemen. People tolerated, but rarely respected. Yet beneath the surface of that hierarchy, something strange was happening. While nobles measured power in land and soldiers, merchants measured power in movement, movement of goods, movement of information, movement of money. And movement is where real power lives. Picture a medieval port city at dawn. Ships from the Mediterranean arriving with spices, caravans from the east bringing silk, wagons leaving for distant kingdoms with wool, metal, and wine. Every crate unloaded, every transaction made, every shipment recorded, passed through the hands of merchants. Kings ruled territory, but merchants ruled trade routes. And trade routes connected the entire known world. A king might dominate one kingdom. A merchant network could dominate 10. This created a dangerous imbalance, because a king's wealth was limited by land, taxes from farmers, tribute from nobles. But merchants had something infinitely expandable: profit. Each successful trade multiplied their wealth. A shipload of spices bought for silver in the East could sell for 10 times its value in Europe. And unlike land, trade had no ceiling. The more routes you controlled, the richer you became. But the true secret of merchant power wasn't trade itself. It was risk. Nobles feared risk. A noble's entire identity depended on stability: his land, his title, his lineage. Losing everything meant losing his place in the social order. Merchants, however, were already outsiders. They had nothing to lose by gambling. So they began doing something revolutionary. They started financing risk. They funded ships, caravans, explorations, entire trade expeditions across oceans and deserts. And with each expedition came a new invention: insurance, partnerships, profit sharing, early banking. These weren't just financial tools. They were weapons. Weapons that allowed merchants to scale wealth faster than any king ever could. By the 13th and 14th centuries, certain merchant families had accumulated fortunes that rivaled entire kingdoms. The kings noticed. And when kings notice wealth, they try to control it, sometimes through taxation, sometimes through intimidation, sometimes through confiscation. But merchants had something kings didn't understand: mobility. If a king became too greedy, merchants simply moved their money elsewhere. Another city, another kingdom, another ruler who was willing to play by their rules. And this created a new power dynamic. For the first time in history, kings had to compete for merchants. Cities offered privileges, lower taxes, legal protections, special trading rights, all to attract the people who controlled the flow of wealth. But the real turning point came when kings started running out of money. Wars were becoming more expensive, armies larger, weapons more advanced, and royal treasuries were often empty. That's when the crown did something unthinkable. It borrowed. And the lenders were merchants. Families like the great banking dynasties of Italy began financing monarchs, wars, and entire governments. Once that happened, power quietly changed hands. Because when a king owes you money, you don't need a crown to rule him. When kings first borrowed money from merchants, it seemed harmless. After all, what was a loan to a king? A temporary solution, a way to fund a war, pay soldiers, or stabilize a treasury. But debt has a strange psychological effect. The moment someone depends on you financially, the balance of power begins to shift. And merchants understood this long before kings did. Consider the great merchant bankers of medieval Europe, families like Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. Officially, they were just bankers. Unofficially, they were the invisible rulers of the city. The Medici didn't wear crowns, they didn't lead armies, but they controlled the credit that funded princes, nobles, and even the church. Their bank handled transactions for the Vatican itself. And when the most powerful religious institution in Europe trusted your money, your influence became untouchable. This was a new kind of power, quiet, financial, invisible. Unlike kings, merchants rarely ruled openly. That would attract enemies. Instead, they mastered a far more effective strategy: influence without exposure. They funded political allies, placed relatives in key positions, sponsored churches, universities, and public works. To the common people, they looked generous. To rulers, they looked indispensable. But behind every generous donation was a calculated investment in power. And here is where the psychological game becomes fascinating. Kings ruled through fear. Merchants ruled through dependency. A king could threaten rebellion with soldiers, but merchants could do something far more devastating. They could stop the flow of money. No loans, no credit, no funding for wars, no financing for infrastructure. The economy would simply freeze. And when the economy froze, even kings became powerless. History is full of rulers who learned this lesson too late. Take the infamous conflict between the French crown and the powerful banking families of Italy, or the moment when rulers tried to seize merchant wealth directly. Sometimes they succeeded, but often it backfired, because wealth that moves is impossible to capture. If a king confiscated a merchant's fortune, the surviving merchants simply relocated. Another city welcomed them. Another ruler offered protection. And with them went the trade routes, the ships, the credit networks. In other words, the real economy. This is why certain medieval cities suddenly exploded in power, places like Venice and Genoa. These were not vast kingdoms. They were merchant republics. Their leaders were often traders and bankers, not warriors. Yet they controlled fleets that dominated the Mediterranean. Their wealth rivaled empires, and their political systems reflected a brutal truth. In a world driven by trade, money was stronger than bloodlines. But perhaps the most interesting part of this story is what it reveals about human nature. Kings believed power came from hierarchy, titles, tradition, divine right. Merchants believed power came from leverage, control something others desperately need, and they will eventually serve you, even if they wear a crown. By the late Middle Ages, the old social order was already cracking. Feudal power was weakening. Trade networks were expanding across continents, and merchant wealth was beginning to reshape politics itself. Bankers influenced wars, financed exploration, funded the rise of new states. In many ways, the modern world was born from this quiet shift, not from swords, but from ledgers. And if you look carefully at today's world, you might notice something eerily similar. Governments still exist. Leaders still hold titles. But the true centers of influence often sit elsewhere. Inside financial networks, global corporations, institutions that control the flow of capital. The same principle that empowered medieval merchants still operates today. Because history has a dark lesson most people ignore. Kings may rule the land, but those who control the flow of money eventually rule the kings.